The laptop shattered against the marble floor of the boardroom, glass and metal scattering like shrapnel across polished shoes worth more than Marcus Cole's monthly rent. Every executive froze. The female CEO, Victoria Sterling, stood motionless, her face drained of color. But Marcus, the night janitor with calloused hands and a daughter waiting at home, didn't apologize. He didn't run. He simply looked her dead in the eyes and said nothing, because what was on that screen, what he'd accidentally seen while emptying her trash bin, would either destroy her empire or save his daughter's life. And in that split second, everything changed. Marcus had been invisible for 3 years. That's how long he'd pushed his cleaning cart through the glass towers of Sterling Industries, arriving at 11 p.m. when the executives were long gone, leaving before dawn broke over the city. He wore the same navy blue uniform, kept his head down, and existed in the spaces between other people's lives. Nobody knew his name. Nobody asked about the medical bills folded in his wallet or the insulin pump his 8-year-old daughter Lily needed. The one insurance wouldn't cover. The one that cost more than he made in 6 months. Nobody knew that Marcus Cole had once been an architect, that his hands, now wrapped around a mop handle, had once drafted buildings that touched the sky. That was before his wife Sarah died during childbirth complications, before the medical debt swallowed his savings, before grief and survival became the only things that mattered. He'd traded his drafting table for a janitor's closet because night shifts paid slightly more, and because working while Lily slept meant he could be there when she woke up, could make her breakfast, walk her to school, pretend their world wasn't held together by prayer and expired coupons. The towers of Sterling Industries rose 47 stories above downtown, all glass and steel and ambition. Victoria Sterling's company designed sustainable architecture for a changing world. Buildings that breathed, that bent with earthquakes, that collected rainwater and generated their own power. Marcus used to read about her projects in the trade magazines he still bought from thrift stores. Used to imagine what his life might have looked like if Sarah had lived, if Lily had been born healthy, if the universe had dealt him different cards. But tonight something was different. As Marcus emptied the trash in the executive boardroom on the 42nd floor, Victoria Sterling's laptop sat open on the conference table, alone, abandoned, its screen still glowing in the darkness. She never left it behind. Everyone knew Victoria guarded that laptop like it held state secrets. Yet here it was at 2:47 a.m., its screen displaying something that made Marcus's blood run cold the moment his eyes accidentally landed on it. Medical records. Child's medical records. A little girl named Emma Sterling, age 7, diagnosed with the same rare form of juvenile diabetes that was slowly killing Lily. But these records showed something else. Clinical trial data, experimental treatments, a breakthrough insulin pump system that Victoria's pharmaceutical division had developed, technology that could save children's lives, technology that was being deliberately suppressed. Marcus's hands trembled as he read the emails visible on the screen, messages between Victoria and her board members, discussing how releasing this technology would cannibalize profits from their existing insulin products, how they decided to delay FDA approval for another 3 years, quietly shelving the research while continuing to sell the inferior pumps that barely kept kids like Lily alive. Children were dying, or living half-lives constantly on the edge of crisis, because the math said it was more profitable that way. The cleaning cart clattered as Marcus stumbled backward. His vision blurred. Somewhere in a small apartment across the city, Lily was sleeping, her current pump beeping every few hours, her blood sugar never quite stable, her small body working so hard just to exist. And here was the answer, locked away in corporate strategy documents, hidden behind profit margins and shareholder presentations. Marcus didn't think. His body moved on instinct, on 3 years of exhaustion and fear and watching his daughter suffer. He grabbed the laptop, his fingers leaving prints on the expensive metal case, and in one swift motion he smashed it against the floor. Once, twice, 3 times, until the screen went dark and something inside him shattered along with it. That's when the lights flicked on. That's when he turned and saw Victoria Sterling standing in the doorway, still in her tailored suit, her face unreadable. That's when Marcus realized his daughter's last hope had just been destroyed in a moment of desperate rage. Or maybe just maybe, awakened. Victoria didn't call security. That was the first strange thing. She stood in the doorway of her own boardroom, watching this janitor, this man whose name she'd never bothered to learn, standing over the remains of her laptop like a soldier over a battlefield. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither could yet name. Marcus waited for the inevitable, the police, the lawsuit, the end of everything. Instead, Victoria walked slowly into the room, her heels clicking against marble, and closed the door behind her. She looked at the shattered laptop. Then at Marcus. Her eyes, he noticed for the first time, were tired in a way no amount of expensive concealer could hide. There were shadows beneath them, the kind that came from nights spent awake, wrestling with choices that had no good answers. Marcus found his voice, though it came out rough, sandpapered by emotion. But he didn't speak because this wasn't his moment to explain. Not yet. He simply stood there, his chest heaving, his janitorial uniform suddenly feeling like a costume for a role he'd never auditioned for. A single father pretending he wasn't drowning. A former architect pretending he wasn't still designing towers in his sleep. A man pretending his daughter's life wasn't slipping through his fingers, one blood sugar reading at a time. Victoria moved to the window, looking out over the city lights. When she finally turned back, her expression had shifted into something Marcus couldn't quite read. Part calculation, part something that looked almost like relief. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder. Not the laptop's data. Something else. Something she'd been carrying. Inside were medical records. Emma Sterling's complete file, but with pages Marcus hadn't seen on the screen. Pages showing that Emma had died 4 months ago. That the experimental insulin pump, the one that could have saved her, had been finished 2 weeks too late. That Victoria had been living in a private hell, sitting in board meetings, discussing profit margins for a product that might have kept her daughter alive if she'd pushed harder, moved faster, cared less about the company and more about the children it was supposed to serve. Marcus felt his knees weaken. The monster he'd imagined, the cold CEO sacrificing children for stock prices, dissolved in front of him. What stood in its place was something more complicated. A mother who'd lost everything and was trying to figure out how to make it mean something. A woman who'd been writing resignation letters at 2 a.m., unable to sleep in the empty house where her daughter's room remained untouched. Coming back to the office because it was the only place she could still pretend to have purpose. Victoria had been planning to release the pump technology. The shattered laptop contained the presentation she was going to give the board next week, a proposal to open source the research, to partner with nonprofits to accept the profit loss because no other parent should have to watch what she'd watched. The emails Marcus had seen were old correspondence, artifacts from a version of herself she no longer recognized. She'd kept them as evidence, as ammunition for the fight she was about to wage against her own board of directors. And Marcus had just destroyed the only copy. The backup drives were in that laptop. The research files, the presentation that detailed every argument, every financial model showing how they could still survive as a company while doing the right thing. Victoria's tech team had been paranoid about security. Everything encrypted, nothing on the cloud, all the sensitive data kept on her personal device. A precaution against corporate espionage that now meant months of work had just been reduced to broken glass and twisted metal. Marcus sank into one of the leather conference chairs, his head in his hands. He'd been trying to save Lily, and instead, he'd destroyed the very thing that could have saved her. The irony was so brutal it almost made him laugh, except laughing would mean breaking completely, and he couldn't afford that. Lily needed him functional, needed him to wake up in 4 hours and make her breakfast and test her blood sugar and pretend everything was going to be okay. Victoria sat down across from him. Not at the head of the table where she usually commanded her empire, but right across, close enough that Marcus could see the grief etched into every line of her face. She'd learned to hide it during business hours, to paste on the competent CEO mask and make decisions about billion-dollar projects. But at 3 a.m. in an empty boardroom, the mask had cracks. For a long moment, they just sat there, two parents who'd lost their way, whose daughters needed more than the world seemed willing to give. The city sprawled below them, thousands of lights representing thousands of lives, each with their own struggles Marcus would never know about. Somewhere in that maze of streets, Lily was sleeping. Somewhere in a cemetery across town, Emma was beyond sleep. Then Victoria did something that would change both their lives. She pulled out her phone, opened her contacts, and began making calls. Not to security, not to lawyers, to the people who could help them rebuild what had been lost. Her lead researcher, her head of development, the software engineer who'd helped design the encryption. She was calling in favors at 3 a.m., pulling her team from their beds, because sometimes the right thing couldn't wait until morning. And Marcus, still wearing his janitor's uniform, still smelling of industrial cleaning solution and desperation, realized he wasn't invisible anymore. For better or worse, he'd just been seen. By dawn, the boardroom had transformed into a makeshift war room. 6 people sat around the conference table, Victoria's core team, pulled from their homes in the middle of the night, laptops open, coffee going cold in expensive china cups. And Marcus, still in his uniform, somehow now part of something he didn't fully understand. Nobody had asked him to leave. Victoria had simply introduced him as the man who reminded me what we're supposed to be fighting for. And her team had accepted it without question. Too focused on the crisis at hand to wonder why a janitor was sitting in on their emergency session. The lead researcher, Dr. Sarah Chen, had been the first to arrive, her hair still wet from a rushed shower. She'd been with Victoria since before Emma's diagnosis, had worked 70-hour weeks trying to perfect the insulin pump technology, and had held Victoria's hand at the funeral when the CEO finally broke down away from the cameras. Sarah didn't need explanations. She just opened her laptop and started reconstructing their research from backup files scattered across various team members' devices. The picture that emerged wasn't pretty. The main presentation was gone. Yes, Victoria's carefully crafted arguments for why the board should sacrifice short-term profits for long-term humanity. But the core research data still existed in fragments. The problem was authorization. Victoria's plan had required board approval, careful political maneuvering, building consensus among executives who measured success in quarterly earnings. Smashing the laptop had destroyed that careful groundwork. But it had also created something else. Urgency. Marcus watched Victoria make a decision he'd later realize took more courage than any boardroom negotiation. She was going to go around the board entirely. Release the research publicly, open source the pump technology, and let the chips fall where they may. It would likely cost her the company. The board would vote her out, shareholders would sue, her reputation would be shredded in the business press. But children would live. Parents like Marcus wouldn't have to choose between medication and rent. As the team worked, Marcus found himself talking, telling them about Lily in ways he'd never told anyone. How she'd learned to check her own blood sugar at age 5 because he had to work nights. How she sometimes asked if dying would be easier than being sick, and he'd had to explain why living was always worth the fight even when it hurt. How she wanted to be a dancer, but was afraid her body would betray her mid-performance. The team listened, and Marcus could see it registering. The abstract problem they'd been solving had a face now, a name. A father with calluses on his hands and hope dying in his eyes. Dr. Chen pulled Marcus aside during a coffee break. She'd been running calculations, looking at Lily's medical records that Marcus had shared from his phone. The experimental pump could change everything for her. Stabilize her blood sugar, give her freedom, maybe even let her dream about dancing again. But there was a timeline problem. Even if they released the research today, it would take months for other companies to manufacture the pumps, navigate regulatory approval, make them available. Lily needed help now. Then came the moment that would later seem almost miraculous. Dr. Chen had kept 3 prototype pumps in her personal lab, the final versions, fully functional, intended for last-stage trials that had been postponed when Emma died. They were technically Sterling Industries' property, but she'd been holding on to them, unable to let go of the last tangible pieces of work that might have saved Emma. One of those pumps could go to Lily. Today. This morning. Marcus felt something inside his chest crack open, not breaking, but finally letting light in after 3 years of darkness. He thought about Lily waking up in a few hours, eating the off-brand cereal he'd bought on sale, testing her blood sugar with the cheap strips that weren't always accurate, going to school where she'd have to visit the nurse twice a day, and how today, maybe today, that started to change, but Victoria's phone started ringing. The board members, arriving early for their weekly meeting, had heard rumors of unusual activity in the building overnight. Security footage showed Victoria and her team in the boardroom at strange hours. Questions were being asked. The timeline was collapsing. Victoria made another call, this one to a journalist she trusted, someone who'd covered Emma's death with dignity and hadn't sensationalized her grief. She was going to break the story herself before the board could control the narrative. She'd admit everything, the delayed technology, the profit over lives calculations, her own complicity in a system that valued shareholders over sick children. She'd present the research data, announce the open sourcing of the pump technology, and accept whatever consequences came. Marcus watched this woman, this CEO who lived in a world so far removed from his own, prepare to sacrifice everything. Not for redemption, though maybe that was part of it, but because she'd learned what Marcus had always known, that some things matter more than survival, that living with yourself sometimes means losing everything else first. The journalist arrived at 7 a.m. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. They had 2 hours to get the story out before Sterling Industries could bury it in legal language and damage control. 2 hours to make Emma's death and the suffering of children like Lily mean something more than just another tragic story. Marcus called the neighbor who watched Lily before school. He told her he'd be late, very late, maybe not home before Lily left for school. He didn't tell her why, didn't tell her that he was sitting in a boardroom 42 stories above the city, watching his daughter's future being rewritten by people who'd never known she existed until 12 hours ago. Didn't tell her that he'd smashed a laptop and somehow impossibly started a revolution. The news broke at 8:47 a.m., 13 minutes before the Sterling Industries board meeting was scheduled to begin. The journalist published everything: Victoria's full statement, the research data, photos of Emma in her hospital bed that Victoria had never shown publicly, and the damning emails showing how close the company had come to burying life-saving technology for profit. The headline read, CEO exposes her own company's deadly secret after daughter's death. Marcus watched it spread across news sites, social media, morning television shows picking it up in real time. Within minutes, the hashtag Emma's Pump was trending. Parents of diabetic children began sharing their own stories, their own struggles with inadequate equipment and insurance denials. Medical professionals chimed in, confirming what Victoria had revealed, that the technology existed, that it was ready, that the only thing standing between sick children and better lives had been corporate profit margins. The board members arrived to find protesters already gathering outside Sterling Industries headquarters. Not many yet, just a few early morning joggers who'd seen the news and detoured to make their voices heard. But more were coming. The story had struck a nerve, tapping into every parent's primal fear, every patient's frustration with a healthcare system that seemed designed to extract money, rather than preserve life, inside the boardroom. The same room where Marcus had shattered the laptop hours. Earlier, the emergency meeting began without Victoria. She'd refused to attend, instead sitting in her office with her core team, waiting for the inevitable. Marcus remained with her, no longer a janitor, but something else now. A witness, maybe, or a reminder of why any of this mattered. The board's decision came within an hour. Victoria Sterling was removed as CEO, effective immediately, for unauthorized disclosure of proprietary information and bringing significant reputational and financial harm to the company. The vote was unanimous among the board members present. They'd also filed for a restraining order to prevent further disclosure and were exploring criminal charges for corporate espionage. But the board had miscalculated the moment. They'd assumed this would be like other corporate scandals, a news cycle that would fade, a controversy that could be managed with careful PR and legal pressure. They didn't understand that Victoria had already won by losing. The research was out, replicated across thousands of servers worldwide within hours. Medical device companies were already analyzing the data, and 3 had announced plans to begin production immediately, with several pledging to provide pumps at cost to uninsured families. The real turning point came when Dr. Chen and 4 other lead researchers resigned in solidarity with Victoria, taking their expertise to a nonprofit that had formed overnight, Emma's Foundation, dedicated to ensuring the pump technology reached every child who needed it. They'd work for a fraction of their Sterling Industries salaries, funded by donations that were already pouring in from people who'd read Emma's story and wanted to help finish what she'd started. Marcus left the Sterling Industries building at noon. No longer an employee, he'd been terminated along with Victoria, his janitorial contract voided for security violations. He walked out through the lobby where he'd entered thousands of times through the service entrance, but this time through the front doors, past news cameras and reporters shouting questions he didn't answer. He was carrying something precious in his backpack, one of Dr. Chen's prototype pumps, pre-programmed with Lily's medical data, ready to change her life. The subway ride home felt surreal. Marcus sat among other passengers heading to lunch breaks and afternoon shifts, people absorbed in their phones, unaware that the tired man in the wrinkled janitor's uniform had just been part of something that would be studied in business ethics classes for decades. He thought about Victoria, now in meetings with lawyers, probably facing years of legal battles. He thought about Emma, who'd never know that her death had been transformed into something that might save thousands of lives. But mostly, he thought about Lily, about her face when he'd explained that things were going to get better, that her blood sugar could be stable, that she wouldn't have to visit the nurse twice a day, that maybe, just maybe, she could audition for that dance class she'd stopped talking about because hoping hurt too much. Marcus arrived home at 2 p.m. Lily would be back from school in an hour. The apartment was exactly as he'd left it. Dishes in the sink, her latest blood sugar log on the refrigerator, her backpack hanging on the hook that was almost too high for her to reach, but she insisted on using, because big girls didn't need the lower one. Everything was the same, except everything had changed. He sat on their worn couch, the one they'd bought secondhand when Lily was 2, and pulled out his phone. The news was still exploding. Economists predicting Sterling Industries' stock collapse, medical ethicists praising Victoria's decision, patient advocacy groups declaring victory. But Marcus scrolled past all of that to the photos in his camera roll. Lily at age 3 before the diagnosis, chubby-cheeked and fearless. Lily at 5, learning to check her blood sugar, her small face serious with concentration. Lily last month, looking tired in a way no 8-year-old should, smiling for the camera because she knew it made him feel better. His phone rang. Victoria Sterling. She'd gotten his number from the employee files before being escorted out of the building. Her voice was calm, calmer than it had been all night. And she asked if they could meet, not as former CEO and former janitor, but as 2 parents who understood that sometimes you have to break things to fix what matters. Marcus said yes, because he was learning that the most important moments in life often started with unlikely people in impossible situations, choosing to see each other as fully human. 3 months later, Marcus stood in the community center gymnasium, watching Lily perform her first dance recital. She wore a purple costume that she'd picked out herself, and her new insulin pump was tucked discreetly under the elastic, almost invisible, constantly working to keep her blood sugar stable without her having to think about it. She moved across the floor with the other children, her steps not quite perfect but filled with a joy that made Marcus's throat tight. Next to him, Victoria sat in a folding chair that was probably uncomfortable for someone who'd spent years in executive leather, but she didn't seem to notice. She'd driven across the city to be here, had asked if it would be okay, and Marcus hadn't known how to say no to the woman who'd sacrificed her empire so his daughter could dance. The legal battles were ongoing. Sterling Industries was suing Victoria for breach of fiduciary duty, corporate espionage, and a dozen other charges that came with potential prison time. Her lawyers were confident they'd win. Public sentiment was overwhelmingly on her side, and several board members had quietly resigned under pressure, their own emails revealing just how complicit they'd been in delaying the pump technology. But the process would take years, would cost Victoria everything she'd built, and would follow her name forever. Emma's foundation had distributed over 2,000 pumps in 12 weeks. Dr. Chen had assembled a team of engineers, researchers and volunteers who worked out of a converted warehouse, manufacturing the devices and getting them to families who needed them most. They partnered with hospitals, worked with insurance companies, and when bureaucracy moved too slowly, they just gave the pumps away, funded by donations that kept growing as more people heard Emma's story. Marcus had found new work, not as a janitor, but as a project coordinator for Emma's foundation. Victoria had insisted, saying they needed someone who understood what it felt like to be on the receiving end of the healthcare system, someone who could spot the gaps between policy and reality. The pay was modest, but it came with health insurance that actually covered Lily's needs, and it let him work normal hours, be present for school pickups and homework help, and ordinary parent things he'd almost forgotten existed. But more than that, it gave him purpose beyond survival. He spent his days talking to families like his had been, scared, overwhelmed, trying to navigate medical systems that seemed designed to make simple things complicated. He'd listen to their stories, help them access the pumps, and sometimes just sit with them in the understanding that came from shared struggle. He'd become a bridge between the world Victoria had left and the world he'd almost been trapped in forever. The dance recital ended with enthusiastic applause from parents recording on phones, and Lily ran off stage and directly into Marcus's arms, breathless and glowing. She smelled like hairspray and the strawberry body spray she'd begged for at the drugstore. And she was talking a mile a minute about how she'd almost forgotten the second turn, but remembered just in time. Victoria watched them, and Marcus saw it, the shadow of grief that crossed her face, the quick calculation of Emma's age, the parallel life that should have been. Lily noticed her, this elegant woman in expensive clothes that didn't quite match the gymnasium's casual atmosphere, and in that fearless way children have, asked who she was. Marcus could have said former CEO or the woman who helped get your pump. Instead, he said friend, and Victoria's expression shifted into something that might have been gratitude or might have been relief, that she was still capable of being defined by something other than her failures and her losses. They went to dinner at a diner Lily loved, the kind with plastic-covered menus and unlimited refills and servers who called everyone honey. Victoria sat in the booth and ordered pancakes, and Lily chatted about her dance teacher and her best friend's birthday party and a science project about volcanoes. Normal, beautiful, ordinary life, the kind Emma would never have. The kind Victoria was learning to witness without letting grief consume her completely. After dinner, walking to their cars in the parking lot, Victoria told Marcus something she hadn't told anyone. The board had offered her a settlement, drop the lawsuit, sign an NDA, take a generous payout, and disappear quietly. She'd refused, not because she needed to win, but because the moment she signed that silence, Emma's story became just another corporate scandal that got swept away. As long as the case was public, people remembered. As long as her name stayed in the news attached to the words insulin pump and children's lives, the pressure stayed on other companies to do better. Marcus understood what that cost. Victoria had lost her company, her reputation in certain circles, most of her wealth to legal fees and funding Emma's foundation. She'd lost sleep and probably years off her life from stress. But she'd gained something too. The knowledge that Emma's 7 years on Earth had led to something bigger than a tragic obituary. They said goodbye in the parking lot, and Marcus drove home with Lily, who fell asleep in the back seat before they'd made it 3 blocks. Exhausted from dancing and excitement, and the normal tiredness of childhood, rather than the exhausted sickness that used to define her days. Marcus carried her up to their apartment, settled her into bed without waking her, and checked her pump's readings, all stable, all normal, all indicating a body that was finally getting what it needed to thrive. He stood in her doorway for a long moment, watching her sleep, and thought about all the moments he'd stood in this exact spot, afraid she wouldn't wake up, afraid her blood sugar would crash in the night, afraid he was failing her by not being able to afford better care. That fear was gone now. Not completely. He was still a parent, still wired to worry, still aware of how fragile life could be. But the specific terror that had defined the last 3 years had loosened its grip. Lily had a chance now, a real chance. Marcus returned to the living room, sat on their second-hand couch, and pulled out the folder Victoria had given him. Architectural drawings for a new Emma's Foundation headquarters, a building that would need to be designed by someone who understood both engineering and empathy. She'd asked if he'd consider it, not as charity but because she genuinely believed he was the right person. His license was still valid if dusty. His skills were still there, if underused. Outside, the city hummed with its late-night rhythms. Somewhere in a cemetery, Emma Sterling's grave had fresh flowers. Victoria visited every Sunday, rain or shine, bringing updates on how many children had been helped that week. Somewhere in a legal office, lawyers were drafting motions and counter-motions for a case that would take years to resolve. Somewhere in a hospital, a child was receiving their first Emma's Foundation pump, their parents crying with relief that looked a lot like how Marcus had felt 3 months ago. And here, in a small apartment that had seen so much fear and is now learning joy again, a single father sat with architectural drawings spread across the coffee table, designing a building that would help save lives, while his daughter slept soundly in the next room. Sometimes heroes wore suits and commanded boardrooms. Sometimes they wore janitors' uniforms and pushed cleaning carts through empty buildings at 3 a.m. Sometimes they were just people, broken, scared, doing their best, who found each other at exactly the right moment and decided that love was more important than fear, that some things were worth destroying everything else to protect. The laptop had shattered on a marble floor, and in its breaking, something new had been built, something that looked like hope, felt like redemption, and would echo forward in ways neither Marcus nor Victoria could fully measure. Emma would never dance again, but Lily would, and thousands of other children would because of a choice, made in a boardroom at 3 a.m. by 2. Parents who refused to accept that suffering was simply the cost of doing business. Marcus picked up his pencil and began to sketch. Outside, morning was still hours away, but the darkness didn't feel quite so heavy anymore.